Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to yet another session as we cover issues related to civil resistance, collective nonviolent action, and related topics. Again, my name is Stephen Zunes. I am a professor of politics and international studies at the University of San Francisco. As we have been exploring these past few days, there has been a dramatic growth in the studies of the power of nonviolent action in recent years. And we know, of course, the nonviolent action has played an important role in reform movements within democracies. Of course, the civil rights movement in the United States. The picture on the upper right is of the anti-nuclear power movement in Germany in the 1970s, during the following decade. The one on the lower left was part of a movement which included thousands of arrests, actually, in Australia to stop the construction of a dam in a sensitive environmental area. I use that just to symbolize the many environmental causes. And the one on the lower right is of the feminist women's rights movement in India against rape and other violence against women. But of course, we've also. But this past couple of days, we have put particular emphasis on nonviolent revolutions. These are dramatic revolutionary uprisings, which have at times sent dictators fleeing in the night. Here we have scenes from the Philippines in 1985, Czechoslovakia in 1989, Serbia in 2000, Tunisia in 2013. But what I want to focus on for this session is something that doesn't neatly fit into either category. And these are what I would like to call gradualist pro-democracy struggles. These is in regard to nonviolent struggles against autocratic regimes that failed to topple the dictatorship in a revolutionary wave, but did succeed in forcing a series of legal, constitutional, and institutional reforms over a period of several years, which eventually evolved into a liberal democratic order. As with the more sudden and dramatic transitions, these more gradualist transitions have taken place across different regions and against different kinds of autocratic regimes. They have undergone substantial democratic reforms through protracted nonviolent struggles with no clear, specific, discernible date of transition from authoritarianism to democracy. It's important, I believe, to challenge the tendency by some analysts to mistakenly characterize democratization in these countries as top-down transitions, or focus almost exclusively on competing political elites, rather than appreciate the role of civil society in forcing these reforms. As with the more dramatic, sudden nonviolent democratic transitions, these have again taken place on different continents. Here in South America, we have Brazil and Guyana. In East Asia, South Korea and Taiwan. In Africa, Kenya and Ghana. In Europe, Hungary and Croatia. Today, I want to look at the three cases that are highlighted in red: Kenya, South Korea, and if I may be bold enough to do so, Brazil. These were situations in which the pro-democracy movement was not strong enough to bring down the regime, but the regime was not strong enough to defeat the pro-democracy movement. As a result, it could be argued that under such circumstances, a protracted struggle was inevitable. I want to start with Kenya. The end of the dictatorship in that country is thought of as the second liberation after the original liberation from British colonialism in 1963. While there are still quite a number of remaining obstacles holding back the full consolidation of democracy in that country, Kenyan society is dramatically freer by any number of measures than it was 30 years ago. The largely nonviolent pro-democracy struggle which emerged in Kenya during the mid to late 1980s against the dictatorship of Daniel Arap Moi failed in its goal to force his immediate ouster. Indeed, he was subsequently re-elected twice and remained in office until 2002. However, the movement succeeded in building upon a series of minor concessions by the regime, which eventually added up to major changes in the country's political institutions and political culture. There have been a number of countries where civil insurrections have succeeded in overthrowing a dictator while the regime remains intact. In Kenya, in many respects, it was the other way around. The president remained, but the regime had changed. Due to a divided opposition, Moi was twice re-elected by a narrow plurality, but the mobilization of popular forces resulted in less repression, more political openness and accountability, eventually forced him to step down, and paved the way for the country's current relatively democratic system and burgeoning civil society, which remains strong despite the election a couple years ago of the ideological successors of the old regime and ongoing threats and harassment of some dissident groups. When founding President Jomo Kenyatta died in August of 1978 and was succeeded by his vice president, Daniel Arap Moi, there was hope for political liberalization. Political prisoners were released and other reforms were enacted. However, with the debt crisis prompting the International Monetary Fund and other international lenders to impose structural adjustment programs, it led to widespread economic hardship. So demands that Kenya abandon its neoliberal economic policies grew strong enough that the regime was forced to crack down. In addition, the country remained a one-party state, with the Kenyan African National Union, or KANU, the only legal political party. The first major focus in the stage of the struggle involved the call for the repeal of Amendment 2A of the Constitution, which imposed KANU's one-party rule. This originally began with university protests back in February of 1985. There were more protests in 1987. There were over 100 strikes by labor unions, student groups, and others. More significantly, the decline of political legitimacy in the government, and in the eyes of the people towards the government, became apparent in the March 1988 presidential elections, where, of course, only KANU candidates were running, where 87% of Kenyan voters boycotted the polls. Taken all together, this unprecedented level of dissent left the regime in a quandary. Moi couldn't figure out how to respond and became both more extreme in his repression and more accommodating in his reforms at the same time. The former resulted in greater public anger, and the latter offered hope that the activism was having its desired effect, resulting in the resistance growing even stronger. Churches became a major center of resistance, since it was harder to crack down on respected clergy and other religious leaders, and the strong moral principles of social justice and the Christian tradition, and then became a rallying cry for the resistance. In 1990, an opposition group known by its acronym FORD announced a major rally of regime opponents for July 7th. An event became known as Saba Saba, the Swahili word for the date, 7/7. This is the first major opportunity for Kenyans in opposition to come together, interact, express their opinions. I mean, at that time, it was illegal for a group of more than 4 to even meet together publicly, who are not related, especially on any kind of political context. It was an opportunity to end their isolation, recognize that they were not alone in their opposition, and come forward and express themselves. Despite the risks, many thousands, representing a broad cross-section of the nation, came together to express their feelings in a way that they had not been able to do before, and they did so in this open rebellion against the system. On that July 7th, pro-democracy demonstrations indeed took place throughout the country, particularly in Nairobi, the capital. The regime considered these illegal gatherings, and protesters were viciously attacked by paramilitary forces, and some protesters fought back. In addition to tear gas and truncheons, government forces also opened fire. 28 protesters were killed, and more than 1,000 were arrested. By the middle of 1991, the regime found itself faced with a broad array of increasingly organized dissent from lawyers and other professionals, but also churches, former politicians who had broken with the regime, independent business leaders, and an increasingly angry and vocal, if somewhat disorganized, general public. The tactic of holding political rallies only to have them violently broken up by authorities would not seem to be a very sustainable strategy normally. Yet it played an important role of graphically exposing to both Kenyan and international audiences the extent of human rights abuses in the country. It also helped in raising Kenyans' awareness of rights they had and rights that were being denied. Perhaps most importantly, it was an indication that the collective threshold of fear had been overcome when the government would reiterate its ban on public rallies, but enough people decided that despite the illegality of the action, they would show up anyway. This was successful in allowing for the emergence of opposition political parties. Amendment 2A was indeed repealed, which was one of the major demands of the protests. Unfortunately, Ford, the opposition group, split behind 2 different candidates, and Moi was reelected in 1992 with roughly 38% of the vote, a plurality. Now, despite the emergence of opposition political parties and a number of non-governmental organizations, there was widespread recognition that there could be little substantive change if the same laws and the same Constitution was in effect. Without such change, neither Moy nor any other president, I'm sorry, let me reiterate that. If there could be change in the Constitution, it would no longer be possible for Moy or any other president to get away with abuses. As a result, with a multi-party electoral system now in place, attention could be focused on protecting civil liberties, such as releasing political prisoners, curbing police abuses, ending detention without trial, and other restrictions limiting what Kenyans could do to build a more just and democratic society. Despite allowing for multiple parties and the emergence of these NGOs, Kenyans still did not have the freedom to organize and express themselves politically. Protests and other means of nonviolent resistance continued to be violently suppressed, but resistance continued. One very powerful example was the mothers of political prisoners gathered from around the country, gathered in the main park in central Nairobi, and set up an encampment and vowed to stay until their children were released. They were hassled by police, but they stayed. Many Kenyans came by, listened to their stories, heard about their concerns and their demands, most immediately for the release of their children, but also for the broader changes that needed to be done. There was one dramatic episode when the police moved in to try to evict them. The women ended up baring their breasts, which in that part of Africa, the shame is not on the woman who exposes her breasts, but the man who sees it. Indeed, in certain contexts, is even considered a curse. And this indeed proved to be a deterrent. Eventually, they did move in and destroyed the encampment anyway, though I'm told that the commander who had been given this curse right beforehand suddenly died of a heart attack about 2 months later. But the women fled into the nearby Anglican cathedral, where they were given support and asylum by the bishop. But these and similar actions led to constitutional reform and with greater guarantees for public dissent with greater freedoms. And during the next elections and in 1997, unfortunately, there was a repeat of what had happened 5 years earlier. The opposition was divided, and Moi was reelected yet again. However, he could no longer order people detained without trial. He could no longer charge opponents with sedition simply for criticizing his policies. Unlike many African leaders, he would not be president for life, thanks to term limits that were imposed in the new Constitution. So people knew he would be gone by 2002 at the latest. As one activist I interviewed named Tom DeJerry put it, "We did not win the struggle against Moi, but we won the struggle for the nation." The next case I want to look at is South Korea. Except for a couple of short periods, South Korea had been under autocratic rule since the country emerged out of decades of occupation by Japan and then the partition in 1945. General Park Chung-hee had ruled the country since he seized power in a military coup in 1961. The threat from communist North Korea and the overriding task of rebuilding from the devastation of the Korean War in the early 1950s provide the excuse for the denial of democratic rights. Repression increased following his declaration of martial law in 1972. Open protests began to emerge around 1979. Park and other government leaders were bitterly divided on whether to compromise or to engage in massive and violent repression. Apparently, as a result of a heated argument between the head of the intelligence bureau, known, interestingly enough, as the Korean CIA, KCIA, he ended up shooting and killing Park. Prime Minister Choi Kyu-ja became interim president, who, following a brief state of emergency, enacted a series of reforms, releasing a number of dissidents, including students, religious leaders, and journalists, as well as Kim Dae-jung, the opposition leader who had become the country's most famous political prisoner after being kidnapped from Japan, where he had been, by the KCIA, where he had been living in exile. As the pro-democracy movement took advantage of this slight opening and began gaining strength, however, anti-democratic elements in the military, led by military leader Chun Doo-won, increased their pressure on Choi not to compromise further. In May of 1980, a massive demonstration in Seoul, the capital, brought over 100,000 students and workers into the streets. General Chun successfully pressured Choi to declare full martial law to try to stop the protest, which gave the general effective control of the government to the military, to Chun. Colleges and universities were closed, and the National Assembly was shut down, along with the headquarters of most political parties. Labor strikes were outlawed, and all political activity was banned. Student leaders were detained, and the country's three most prominent dissidents, Kim Dae-jung, Kim Young-sam, and Kim Jong-pil, were arrested. Despite the crackdown in the city of Gwangju in the southwestern part of the country, student-led demonstrations continued. On May 19th, Chun sent in paratroopers who brutally attacked the peaceful demonstrators with truncheons and fixed bayonets, killing as many as 100 people. Students, now joined by thousands of townspeople, fought back. The nonviolent discipline, which had characterized most of the pro-democracy protests in the recent years, evaporated as growing numbers of students, backed by thousands of enraged city residents, raided armories and police stations, grabbed their weapons, and drove the troops from the city. Gwangju became a liberated democratic zone within an authoritarian state. With no one to enforce the ban on demonstrations, over 300,000 people took to the streets on May 20th, protesting the martial law regime. On May 27th, however, Chun dispatched 20,000 elite troops to retake the city. In one of the most infamous massacres of the 20th century, well over 2,000 people were killed as the army retook the city. In the aftermath of the suppression of the Gwangju uprising, Chun banned over 150 periodicals, dismissed large numbers of journalists, and launched what he called a purification campaign, which, while including some corrupt officials and various criminals, was largely focused on purging dissenters. Universities found themselves under heavy police presence. Within months, Chun formally declared himself absolute president. And there was a lull as a result in pro-democracy activism in the next couple of years following the Kwanju massacre, but gradually some renewed organized dissent emerged, resulting in the suspension of certain draconian national security laws and the very unpopular midnight to 4 a.m. nationwide curfew. By late 1983, Chun withdrew his forces from the universities, allowing for limited political activities, releasing student prisoners, and reinstating dismissed faculties. The opposition took full advantage of this opening, with a new wave of protests emerging in 1984. No longer limited to students and a few high-profile dissidents, other social movements, particularly labor unions, emerged in an organized fashion. Significantly, the country's rapidly growing middle class increasingly sided with the pro-democracy forces and joined in the demonstrations and other acts of resistance. The regime then allowed opposition parties, including the New Korean Democratic Party, with its explicit opposition to the dictatorship and support for democracy, to participate in the February 1985 elections for the National Assembly. By 1986, there was direct election. They announced that they would allow for the direct election for the president. In 1987, in that presidential elections the following year, one of the leading dissidents, Kim Jong-sam, ended up making an alliance with the military and ended up winning the election. However, by 1990, there was a full restoration of democracy. Those responsible for the Kwanju massacre were prosecuted, and South Korea remains one of the more vibrant democracies in Asia today. Okay, so turning to Brazil. As you all know, you had the 1964 coup, which ousted João Goulart, and brought forward a series of right-wing military dictatorships. This was the first, and of course, in a series of right-wing coups that would plunge much of South America into years of repression under the so-called national security state. Despite claims by some analysts in North America that Brazil and these other Latin American military regimes voluntarily relinquished power some years later as a result of the deteriorating economic situation, none did so willingly. A nascent pro-democracy movement had emerged in the years immediately following the coup in the form of spontaneous strikes and other nonviolent protests, but was compromised by the emergence of urban guerrillas, armed urban guerrillas whose efforts largely centered on bank robberies and kidnappings, which received little support from the population and allowed the government to get away with massive repression against dissidents, violent and nonviolent alike. Torture and other severe human rights abuses became commonplace against both violent and nonviolent opponents, and by 1974, the armed resistance had been completely destroyed. Not long afterwards, however, dissent from within civil society began to grow, initially by academics and journalists and other professionals. In response, the new military president, General Ernesto, how do you say it, Geisel, promised what he called a slow, gradual, and safe political opening. The liberalization, known as decompression, is that distancial, or is that how you say it? Led to the gradual reemergence of social movements, often with support of the Catholic Church. By 1977, press censorship was relaxed, Habeas corpus for political detainees was resumed, and exiles were allowed to return. A key force in the pro-democracy movement here was the emergence of the ecclesiastical-based communities, which grew from around 30,000 at the beginning of the decade to close to 100,000 by 1980. The CEBs provided opportunities for people from poor backgrounds to develop leadership skills and develop solidarity networks, which was particularly important since a number of the grassroots groups had a hard time mobilizing their constituencies, not just because of the government repression, but the sort of the kind of whole patrimonial tradition here in Brazil, which did not really produce a very favorable cultural climate for this kind of bottom-up grassroots struggle. Yet movements by women, peasants, and favela dwellers did gradually develop, with the church helping these disparate struggles develop a strong solidarity network. Catholic clergy emerged as a major force in the movement against the dictatorship, including many in the hierarchy, such as the Archdiocese of Sao Paulo, which provided an umbrella for key opposition groups. And given the centrality of the church in Brazilian society, there were limits on how brutally the state could respond, especially to clergy in prominent posts. The limited liberalization, along with divisions between hardline and moderate elements in the regime, helped lead to a new wave of protests, which became particularly apparent in the labor sector. By the end of 1978, over 500,000 workers from 14 sectors of the country had gone on extended strikes, including workers in schools, hospitals, banks, and other public services. In 1979, there was an even larger wave of strikes, in which 3.2 million workers participated. Churches, even cathedrals, opened their doors for labor activists whose union halls had been raided by the regime. Going well beyond industrial workers, the walkouts included increasing numbers of professional workers as well, such as state employees, teachers, bank employees, and others. The strike spread to the agricultural sector, with more than 100,000 sugarcane workers in the Northeast refusing to show up for work in October. The following year, over 250,000 Brazilians went on strike. And these strikes, often initiated by unofficial younger leaders, challenged not just employers in the state, but the official pro-government union leaders as well. Brazil, as you know, is a country with a relatively high level of unionization, but especially back then, it was kind of on a corporatist model, which had been easily usurped by the military regime. By the end of the 1970s, however, more than 1/4 of the unionized workers had become part of this new, more radical and democratic syndicalism. The government realized it could no longer control the country's workers. A key demand was that workers be able to negotiate with their employers directly rather than the state. Recognize the impact that the strikes were having on them economically, the leadership of the Sao Paulo business community agreed with the demand and also put forward a manifesto calling for the return to democracy. And again, correct me on the pronunciation, President Figueiredo. Figueiredo promised to hand over the country to a civilian rule by 1985. Yet protests continued. The party of the Brazilian Democratic Movements, PMDB, became the leading opposition party when they were legalized in 1979. Growing protests forced the government to allow for direct elections for all offices except for the president as of 1982. And as with as with the previous elections, the system was stacked in favor of conservative pro-military candidates, yet opposition candidates won most of the important races that year in 1982. Recognizing that the majority of Brazilians opposed the military and their right-wing allies, a key demand of the opposition was the direct election of the president rather than through the military-dominated electoral college. And we also saw the emergence of a civic spirit that the country had not seen since the 1964 coup. Regional rallies were organized, bringing close to 1 million people on the streets in Rio de Janeiro and 1.5 million in Sao Paulo, featuring not just opposition political leaders, but pop stars, soccer announcers, and other entertainers. Though President Sarney proved to be an unpopular president, the democratic transition had been complete. And direct elections, of course, have been held at 4-year intervals. Subsequently, the military is under civilian control, and despite the great inequities and other problems, including the current political and economic crises, the country has emerged to become a democracy. And of course, there is a new constitution, 1987, reducing presidential powers, the direct elections in 1989. Now, what can we learn from these 3 cases and some less detailed examples, less detailed research in some of these other cases? Is that we seem to have kind of a positive feedback loop where nonviolent resistance campaigns force an authoritarian government to open up the system a little bit, to allow for certain structural opportunities for working within the system. That makes possible electoral gains by the opposition. Seeing these electoral gains, it gives the population expectations of success through collective action. And that, in turn, erodes the regime's power to control these movements, thereby making it easier to organize nonviolent resistance campaigns, which open up more structural opportunities, etc. So what I'm saying here is that even if the regime provides only a tiny sliver of political space, activist groups need to move in, fill it up, and just kind of push it, to give more space. And some people may argue this is what is happening in Burma today. The pro-democracy movements in 1988 and 2007, these were brutally suppressed. But as was Kwanju, as was some of the earlier uprisings in Kenya and Brazil, but they eventually succeeded in allowing at least some opposition people in the cabinet and in the parliament, and they are using that to try to open up greater political space. So, what are the variables for success in this kind of model of this gradualist democratization through strategic nonviolent action? The first, I would argue, is effective organization and leaderships. These movements appear to have been structured enough to provide necessary leadership, discipline, organization, and strategic coherence to be effective in the face of repression, but decentralized enough so that the arrest or killing of key leaders would not cripple the movement. In Kenya, it was respected clergy, lawyers, parliamentarians, and other civic leaders who, through a number of ad hoc organizations, eventually formed FORD, the opposition party. In Brazil, it was trade unions and the Catholic Church. In South Korea, it was students, intellectuals, and ultimately trade unionists who coalesced into the National Liaison for Democratization and later what they call the Nanjing movement, which helped make possible the fuller democratization. The second variable for success, I would argue, is discernment and strategy. In all three countries, there appears to have been an awareness of under what circumstances it would be beneficial to work within the limited legal framework allowed by the state, when and under what circumstances to negotiate, and under what circumstances to engage in direct defiance. In Kenya, the opposition agreed to participate in elections despite ongoing limits to civil liberties, with the awareness that legalized political parties would not only be able to participate in elections, but be an organizational base for the ongoing resistance. In South Korea, pro-democracy forces were willing to put their resources into support for political parties like the NKDP or into grassroots coalitions, depending on the circumstances. A similar balancing act took place here in Brazil between the broader grassroots movement and what became the party of the Brazilian Democratic Movement. This confirms what some of the literature in civil resistance studies has argued regarding the importance of developing clear political goals, followed by the development of specific campaigns and tactics desired to achieve short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. It's as the line in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's a time, to everything there is a season. Sometimes you need to focus, on, the working within the system. Sometimes you need to work on challenging the system in direct defiance, and there needs to be a balance depending on the time and circumstances. Third is coalition building. In each country, the pro-democracy resistance demonstrated an ability to build broad alliance among disparate sectors of the population united in a common goal, despite efforts by the government during the transition period to divide and co-opt certain segments of the movement, including a willingness for different segments of the movement to play complementary roles within and outside the established prescribed political order. While the Brazilian opposition maintained a stronger grassroots orientation, all three countries witnessed a close collaboration between opposition political figures and the base of the resistance movement, bringing in churches, workers, students, professionals, and other sectors. And finally, of course, what we have been coming back to quite a bit this week is the importance of nonviolent discipline. Much of the success of these movements rested in the ability to maintain a nonviolent discipline in the sectors engaged in active resistance in order to broaden support for the movement, sow divisions within the regime and its security services, and deny the regime the excuse to slow or reverse reforms. With the exception of the small urban guerrilla movement in the late 60s and early 70s here in Brazil, and the latter phase of the May 1980 Kwanju uprising in South Korea, the opposition struggles in all three countries rejected the use of arms. While rioting and other non-lethal episodes of violence took place in all three countries, the resistance was overwhelmingly nonviolent in orientation. So let me stop here and open things up for questions.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. My question goes to the society point of view. For example, we have some countries that have been recently in war, and the population still uses violence as the only means of resistance. For example, in Timor-Leste, in East Timor, I had the opportunity of working there, and I was very sad when I saw the society that had been recently through violence. 1/3 of the population died, and now they are using violence on the political process. So my question goes to, can you see, you see the variables of success of nonviolent process, but is it possible to see another reason for this phenomena to happen? Like, I was thinking maybe it was cultural, this is a cultural issue, but still I felt it was wrong. No, this is not the only explanation. So for you, not having the variables of success is the only explanation, or you can see another explanation for this phenomena that I think also happens in Africa, in some countries in Africa. Thank you.
I think maybe take two other questions, and I'll try to answer all three.
Minha pergunta... boa tarde. Minha pergunta, ela é, na verdade, relativa à questão do sistema político como um todo, assim. Porque nesses vários casos, tu falaste das situações de colaboração com o sistema político, a tentativa de entrar no sistema político para abrir ele, né? Então, eu fico mais me questionando, porque, por exemplo, pegando uma das primeiras palestras do seminário, tinha a questão de conseguir aqueles 3,5% da população na rua para conseguir derrubar um governo, por exemplo, um regime, né? E aí eu fico pensando que, na verdade, essa colaboração com o sistema político, às vezes, ela pode servir, na verdade, como um efeito que retira as pessoas desse espaço. E é muito comum, quando você tem um tipo de colaboração muito específica com, por exemplo, partidos políticos, pode ser que desmobilize esse movimento e que tire recursos humanos, ou seja, as pessoas que antes estavam engajadas em construir movimentos de base, movimentos de ação não violenta mesmo, etc., passam, na verdade, a disputar as eleições. E aí isso mitiga a possível força que esses grupos teriam. Então, é uma questão que se coloca, por mais que você possa ter abrido o sistema político. Então, assim, é uma questão tênue aí que a gente precisa discutir melhor.
Is there another, or should I go ahead and answer these two? Okay. Well, while you're thinking of other questions, I will answer. Try to answer these two. One reason I chose the three cases that I did was to note that these were from very different cultural traditions, and from very different parts of the world. And I found that almost every culture has certain tendencies to engage in violence, and similarly every culture has some things that make them particularly prone to using nonviolence. And we've seen these kind of movements against in every continent, people from very different religious traditions, cultural traditions. We've seen these against communist regimes, right-wing military dictatorships, monarchies. It's almost every combination you can think of. We have seen these kinds of movements emerge, but specifically in terms of those who have been so traumatized by war, it can work both ways. I mean, it can lead people out of anger and despair to not think strategically and settle their differences by force, but it can also make it clear that people are tired of war, that people have been so the experience of armed struggle has been so dramatic they will go to great lengths to avoid it. We've seen both cases. In the matter of Timor-Leste, let's remember that the armed struggle, most of the massacres, horrific massacres, were in the early stages of the Indonesian occupation in the late 70s and early 80s. And while there was obviously brutal repression, like the Santa Cruz massacre in 1992, it was not the massive daily occurrence as it had been earlier. And similarly, the armed struggle by that time, by the later 1990s, was down to only a few hundred people. The bulk of the struggle was actually forms of nonviolent resistance, such as during the Pope's visit and the like. So I would say that the attempted coups and the factionalism and that kind of thing, I think more has to do with the fact that it is one of the poorest countries in the world. There's been a lot of social dislocation and other things, but the very fact that they at least have remained a parliamentary democracy, that they have been able to have dissenting political groups and free press and that kind of thing is actually pretty darn impressive, given what the people there have gone through. In terms of the whole risk of collaborating too much and taking the wind out of the sails of the movement. Unfortunately, it's very, even if there is no co-optation, even if there is no electoral alternative, it is very, very, very difficult to get that 3.5%. And I think more what I've seen is actually it complements the struggle, as I showed in that positive feedback loop. That makes people because it makes people say, "Hey, we are making progress." Because often, if you're in a movement where you're suppressed, people say, and it goes on for years. People are like, what's the hope? There's been no change whatsoever. Whereas if there are these political openings in the electoral system, people might say, "Hey, we're doing some good. This is working. We still have a long way to go, but we can tell there's progress. We just need to keep on keep on going." But I think you actually raise a larger point. I'm not that I don't think's been addressed directly yet, and that is is important to continue the nonviolent struggle, even if you have full electoral democracy. You can't trust the politicians. As I've said several times this week already, a luta continua. In fact, it's rather interesting. During the height of student protests in the United States in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, not just in opposition to the Vietnam War, but people making much more radical demands, challenging the entire capitalist system and challenging patriarchy, starting to really work for radical change. That is when the Congress and the states passed a constitutional amendment that lowered the age from 21 to 18. And it's interesting, if you see the debate, the transcripts of the debate in Congress about this constitutional amendment, members of Congress of both parties were quite explicit, saying, "Hey, maybe if we get young people involved in electoral campaigns, and voting, they'll be less likely to engage in direct action. They'll be less likely to engage in these kinds of radical protests. So, you know, because it wasn't like there was a great demand for this. I mean, we were glad to have that. I mean, after all, they were sending my peers to Vietnam to die, and we weren't able to vote on whether we candidates who opposed the war. But that wasn't a big demand. That was not really that big an issue. It was an initiative from Washington, not from the young people, to lower the voting age. And so I think, you know, and I think the empirical literature is pretty strong on a whole number of issues. That you need both strategies. I think there are a lot of people I think a lot of people think, oh, we have a democracy, we can elect people, so let's not do direct action. That's disruptive. Let's work within the system. And you know, I do believe there's still a place for nonviolent direct action, but there's also some elements in the far left that see any kind of work, you know, any kind of work within the electoral system as some kind of sellout, and are totally cynical and are, you know, it's everything or nothing, you know, revolution or nothing. And you know, I think again we need to recognize how they can in fact you know, complement each other. Because when I think about the situation in my country. If you think about the reforms and changes we've had in my lifetime, the ending legal segregation in the South, ending the Vietnam War, suspending the growth of nuclear power and having stronger environmental laws, stopping U.S. intervention in Central America, and you know you know, and ending support for apartheid, et cetera, et cetera. You know, when you think of all these major changes in U.S. policy, it was not because of some enlightened political leaders in the Democratic Party or whatever, you know, saying, oh, we should do this because it's a good thing. It's because you had popular movements that drag them kicking and screaming to take these positions they would not have otherwise taken. And it's in many ways it's less important the leaders you elect as the choices you give them. At the same time, I'm sure here in Brazil, as in the United States, there are some political parties who might be more willing to listen to mass movements than others. So it is, you know, also important to vote for, you know, parties that might have a more progressive and democratic agenda. But, you know, regardless of who, you know, occupies the presidency or the Congress, it's important to, you know, still be involved in popular struggle. Other questions? Or comments, criticism? I have a question to you. Was it a fair summary of the Brazilian struggle against the dictatorship? I know most of you weren't around then, but...
Boa tarde, primeiramente, fora Temer, para não perder costume. Agora há pouco você falou sobre a ditadura militar no Brasil, e a gente, pelo menos, tipo, agora mesmo, assim, na atualidade, a gente costuma falar, porque é uma realidade, a polícia continua matando, continua estuprando. Tipo, a polícia vai às favelas, mata, tipo, mulheres, negros, crianças. E, normalmente, quando ela invade alguma favela, comunidade, as pessoas de lá, elas fazem protestos, fazem cartazes, bloqueiam vias, queimam pneus, e elas resistem, certo? Mas, mesmo assim, a polícia continua matando. Eu não consigo ver uma relação entre uma resistência não pacífica e uma alteração no sistema nesse caso. Eu não consigo ver um efeito aí, porque ela continua matando e estuprando.
Indeed, it's very frustrating and indeed horrifying, and in fact the abuses by the Brazilian police, things like the murder of street children, is known even in the United States. It is it's something that unfortunately, Brazil has a bad reputation about. And it's the good news is at least people are resisting. They're not just being victims. But again, it's not a matter of, well, the limited nonviolent struggles do not work, are not stopping this, therefore you need to be violent. It may be more a matter of you need to think of a more strategic approach to build certain alliances that we just as the previous session this morning when it was about rapists and even here on campus, I emphasized that it was not up to women to stop rape, it was up to men to stop rape. I think similarly, it is not the people of the favelas that it's not their responsibility to stop these abuses. It's the responsibility of every Brazilian. In fact, for that matter, I would say, given that the United States provides Brazil with much of the police equipment that's used in the killing and repression, I'd say it is responsibility of people like me and other Americans as well. But that the resistance is it should not be simply a bunch of white people standing back and cheering the people of the black people in the favelas resisting. This is not like a U.S. professional basketball game. This is about having there needs to be involvement. What if, for example, a raid was expected and the police charged in addition to the usual people resisting, you found a large number of white middle-class university students and others there in solidarity with the people? What if there was, in response to, say, a particularly brutal raid, a general strike called by major unions? What if there was, since I don't know the situation, I don't know if any of this is realistic or if any of this would work, so please don't take this as advice. I'm just, throwing out these kinds, just as examples that, almost every successful struggle, while certainly the leadership needs to come from the people who are most affected, they need to have allies. And I think the civil rights struggle would not have been as successful as it was were it not for the fact that they had white allies who were also being beaten and tear gassed and jailed. This is important in South Africa as well. And similarly, when you have Israelis and internationals joining with Palestinians in Budrus and Belin and other, West Bank towns that are under siege, that it's the important. I think the important thing is to think strategically and how a movement could be broadened, bring in more people, and what kind of impact that might have. Machi or Erica, do you want to add anything to that? Or? I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions, if there are any.
Vou continuar pouco do ponto que a Maíris levantou. Porque quando a gente pensa nessas variáveis do sucesso, é o sucesso de quê? O sucesso de você voltar para um regime democrático, certo? E o que a Mayra está falando é que mesmo quando nós estamos debaixo de um regime democrático, nós percebemos que essa democracia ela funciona de formas extremamente diferentes para determinados grupos sociais, para determinados grupos políticos, né? E aí isso num contexto de um país só. Quando você estende isso para um contexto internacional, você vê que esse entendimento de democracia ele é ainda mais frágil, uma vez que em certos locais a democracia que promove direitos democráticos em um território vai ser a mesma democracia que vai, por exemplo, como a gente já comentou aqui em vários momentos, que vai financiar regimes autoritários em outros, e guerra, enfim. Partindo desse entendimento, a gente tem que entender que a resistência não violenta, eu gosto muito desse conceito de resistência não violenta como sendo aquela que não usa armas necessariamente, porque neste momento muito da nossa resistência é considerada violenta pela sociedade brasileira, né? Mas de fato a gente não está pegando em armas, mas muito da nossa resistência aqui é considerada violenta por parte significativa da sociedade brasileira. Então esse conceito de não violência como sendo de armas é muito interessante. Mas quando você parte do entendimento de que a resistência não violenta de armas ainda e você acaba adotando um pouco, aderindo a essa democracia, às vezes sem fazer o devido questionamento, a que democracia é essa? Então, acho que foi um pouco isso que a Maíris levantou. Então, um exemplo muito bom que eu achei que ela fosse falar, mas ela não falou, que é da situação do campo. Né? Assim, a gente teve um rompimento democrático em 64 e em abril desse ano, só que assim, depois da redemocratização até o golpe, a gente teve um período de 27 anos de democracia, mas ainda assim, as pessoas no campo morrem. A luta do campo, ela é coagida de forma armada. A polícia realmente mata os dirigentes. Isso é uma coisa, matam filhos, enfim, isso é uma coisa comum. O nome dos assentamentos do MST são nomes de companheiros que morreram. Aqui, mês passado, morreu um companheiro do Goiás. Enfim, são muitos exemplos, né? Então, é mais ou menos isso que ela estava tentando levantar.
Yeah. That is very important. But I'll let you add something if you want. I want to have time to answer. So, yeah. Go ahead.
Só em relação ao que ambas falaram, assim, porque aqui a gente é um grupo um pouco heterogêneo, um pouco diferente do que você pode encontrar. A gente não é realmente, o que está nessa sala, representativo da maioria brasileira. Ainda assim, a gente tem uma descrença enorme em instituições, e inclusive na nossa própria democracia, e isso não é à toa, assim. Então, o que você falou, eu não acho que seja responsabilidade das mulheres pararem os estupros, assim, dos homens, eu estou 100% de acordo, mas eu vejo os meus amigos terem dificuldade de romper laços com estupradores e falar, eu não vou sentar no bar com você, porque você é um estuprador. Eles não conseguem fazer isso, eles sorriem amarelo. Então, assim, é difícil você suscitar empatia num nível que você, no nível do desconforto alheio.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, right. These are very important questions, and I want to emphasize that in answering them, I'm speaking as an individual. The International Center on Nonviolent Conflict does not take any specific position about party politics or imperialism or capitalism or patriarchy or whatever. We're a educational foundation, so as long as you understand that, I will begin. For me personally, I believe democracy, real democracy, is more than elections. It is more than simple civil liberties. You know, when you have very powerful economic interests and foreign imperialist powers, exerting the kind of influence they have over ordinary people, that is not democracy in my view. It is not democratic in a country that has as much potential wealth as Brazil, and I could say the same about my country and quite a few others, to have such enormous inequality with people starving. And when you have, and I don't think it's democratic when you have such institutionalized racism in every aspect of societies, from popular culture to police, to the courts, to economic opportunities, etc. This particular study involved struggles for liberal democracy, and I think it would illustrate a lot of important points for those of us who are interested in studying the power of civil resistance. But I did not wish to imply that everything is okay and that's the end of it. As I mentioned in an earlier talk that I mentioned some of you are not at, is that one thing that is good about liberal democracy is that it does provide political space for those of us who want more radical change to organize. There's less fear of being killed or jailed or exiled than under a military dictatorship. I believe that Brazil is much better off now, despite its many problems, than it was under the generals. At the same time, the problem is that a lot of people feel, oh, since we're a democracy, everything is okay, and we don't need to engage in popular struggle. And indeed, it looks like there's a fair amount of evidence to suggest that, ironically, it is easier to organize mass movements under dictatorships than democracies in certain ways, because everybody knows the system is messed up. The system is unfair when you have an authoritarian ruler, but people can be fooled to think that if you have elections, therefore it is truly, representative and et cetera. But again, that goes back to the idea of conscientization. And because I think one thing, and I'm speaking as someone who, when I was in university, I was part of a revolutionary group, and I was it was a nonviolent revolutionary group, but we had very revolutionary goals and ideas, and a very radical critique of imperialism and capitalism and the like. And I'm still in many ways sympathetic with that perspective. But I think there's also a tendency, and I remember this myself, is that you want to be. It is a great feeling to be out there on the streets. It's a great feeling to be involved in direct action. It's a great feeling to be confronting power. It is. It's exciting, and when I think of some of the most wonderful experiences in my life, it was when I was being arrested with hundreds of other people, and there is something, that's when you are willing to cross that line and say, hey, I'm a white middle-class boy who recognizes what's wrong, and I'm willing to not play by the rules because I morally feel very strongly about this. And so I certainly empathize with the idea of that. Yes, let's go and struggle, but in reality, that is only a small piece of it. Much of the struggle is not the exciting parts. Much of the struggle is not what you see on television. It is not the manifestations of hundreds of thousands of people in the streets or arrests or whatever. It is the people going to door, talking to ordinary people in different communities. If you talk to people who have led these revolutionary movements, I think people often, when you see these big uprisings, it's like, oh, this is spontaneous. Suddenly, boom, there's this overthrow of a government. No, it took them years. Otpor in Serbia. These guys started off with just less people than are in this room, and they started very, very slowly. almost all these movements started small and grew, and it wasn't like they, suddenly, grew spontaneously. You had to talk to people you didn't necessarily agree with. You had to, leave the university and go into the poor neighborhoods. You had to go into the rural areas. You had to, do the kinds of I mean, when you think about those of you who've had a shift in political opinion, it's not usually because you saw a demonstration going down the street, or you read about it in the newspaper. It was because somebody you liked and trusted talked to you, and more important, listened to you, and were able to communicate and raise your consciousness. And so I think that is really, if those of you who, like me, are interested in more radical change, I think that is a very, very important piece. And this is not to say that protests and nonviolent action aren't important. Most of you are probably familiar with Che Guevara and Regis Debray, the idea of propaganda of the deed. They believe that, if you could just do enough dramatic actions, it would inspire people to join a mass movement. You'd have your revolution. Well, we saw what happened to Che. That really didn't work. In part because I think people, like the peasants in Bolivia and elsewhere, were not ready to join a Marxist-Leninist armed movement, even though they had very legitimate grievances. And especially since it involved killing and getting killed. But we have seen cases where propaganda of the deed can work in nonviolent struggles. For example, on a nuclear power question. In the 1970s, President Nixon wanted to have 1,000 nuclear power plants by the year 2000. But there are some of us who had very serious concerns about the dangers of that technology. And we occupied the construction sites of nuclear power plants, so we were arrested. And even though 80% of the American people supported nuclear power at that time, they'd read about this and say, why are people protesting nuclear power? It's supposed to be safe and clean and efficient. The utility company tells us all the time, and the government tells us all the time. But as the movement grew, people started to learn and question about nuclear power. And when there was a nuclear accident at a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania, in 3 Mile Island in 1979, which came very, very close to a massive core meltdown, the press publicized it, and it helped turn the tide against nuclear power. And by the year 2000, we only had 100 nuclear power plants instead of 1,000, and they're now decommissioning most of those. So and there have been 2 nuclear accidents in previous years that were almost as bad, but they did not get publicity because there wasn't a movement. The press just agreed, followed whatever the utility company said in terms of reassuring people. So I do believe there are cases where that even when you're a minority, nonviolent action can be an educational tool. That propaganda of the deed can be useful, but it is no substitute for the hard person-to-person, day-to-day work of not dramatic, not romantic, not always fun, but very important and necessary work of conscientization and working. I realize you have a harder time here because Brazil is kind of your motto is order and progress, not freedom and justice. There are certain cultural things you have to overcome, but slavery was part of the culture here for centuries. There are a lot of things that are part of the culture here and in Europe and the United States that have been overcome gradually, but it was because younger generations like yourselves decided that they didn't like the old political culture and decided they wanted to change it and did the work to make it possible.